Um, so I want to say this probably starts somewhere around, around 2006. I was living in New York City, where I was born and raised, and I was in a relationship. I was in a very long-term relationship. We were together. His name was Michael, and he and I were together for 16 or 17 years, something like that. And our relationship ended, and it ended amicably, but it ended. And it was a very weird experience having that relationship end, because we were together for so long, and he knew my family and I knew his family, and he was my family. And so the assumption was that we were going to be together forever, that was just going to be it, right? But it wasn't. We just sort of grew apart. And at one point we sort of realized that we were better friends than we were lovers. So that relationship ended, and my whole life was just in upheaval, and had to figure out where to live and all that stuff. Now, you know how when you're in a relationship that ends, I do this at least, and I'm sure a lot of people do this as well. You kind of get off on being morose a little bit. Like, I kind of really got into the wallowing of it, like the feeling, the grief, and the sadness of this, the ending of this relationship, this whole new experience. And you know how some people, you sit there at night with your headphones on and you listen to sad music or just stuff like that. You really get into the melancholy of it. So that's what I was doing, for sure. I was absolutely wallowing in it. And I remember, and there was one day where I was on my computer, and I just kind of wanted to find sad poems. I mean, that's where my headspace was. I wanted to find sad poems. I wanted to be sad. I wanted to find poems specifically about breaking up, right? So I go scouring through the internet, looking for sad poems, breakup poems. And I found a lot of stuff, of course. But there was one poem in particular that I found, and it was, in fact, not sad at all. It was very life-affirming. It was very uplifting. It was about finding that person. The poem was, in fact, called "Wait for Him," and that's the idea of the poem, like waiting for that person. That person is going to show up, and I really loved it. But it was on a weird website. It was on somebody had just put a bunch of poems that they liked up onto some site, and the poems didn't have the person who did this didn't have the author's name on the poems, or in fact, I think most of them didn't even have the titles of the poem. It was a weird little site. I don't know how I found it. It was very random. But anyway, I loved this particular poem so much that I printed it out. I didn't want to lose it. I printed it out, actually on a very little piece of paper, and I folded it up and I put it in my wallet. I don't know why I did that. And I kept it in my wallet. And it sat in my wallet for many years. And every so often, maybe once a year or maybe twice a year, every 6 months, something like that, I would remember that it was there. And I would take it out and I would read it and I go, oh my gosh, I love this poem. That's right, I forgot, blah, blah, blah. So now cut to many years later, I have moved from New York City to Los Angeles, California. And somebody sent me a friend request on Facebook. Because I particularly hate Facebook, I would generally not accept a friend request from a stranger. I was really clear about, only accepting friend requests from actual people, like actual human beings that I've met in real life. However, this guy who sent me this friend request was really hot, really super gorgeous. And so I said, oh yeah, sure, I'll be your friend. So I accepted his friend request, and he immediately wrote me on Facebook and asked me out on a date. And of course, I said yes. So we met, and we were having dinner. Again, gorgeous in person, which was fantastic. His name was Antonio, and we were having dinner. And as you do on a date, you start talking about, you just talk about yourself. You audition. You do an interview. And so we were doing that. And at one point, it came up. He said he really liked poetry. So I said, and it was like, oh, do you? Wait a minute. Hold on a second. I have this poem in my wallet. It's my favorite poem. So I take it out of my wallet and I hand it to him. And he takes it and he looks at it and he looks at me and he says, is this a joke? And I said, no, why? He said, because I wrote this. This is my poem. So I had his poem in my wallet for however many years. I think it was 5 or 6 years. So as soon as he said that, I think I think my mind exploded, and I think I just sort of melted, and so our connection was like instantaneous, and it felt magical. It felt like it was meant to be. Boom! Here was this guy. He had written this poem, and it had been in my wallet the whole time. And so we were like, from that moment on, pretty much we were inseparable. And I think it was after like 2 weeks, maybe 2 weeks. I mean, like seeing each other every day, all day. We thought, oh, let's just move in with each other. And so we did that. And then it was about, it was a few months later. I think it was I'll tell you because I know exactly. It was exactly 4 months to the day after we met. Because we met on April 28th of 2009. We decided that we were going to get married. And at that time, I believe there were only 2, maybe 3 states in the United States where a same-sex couple could get married. I think Hawaii was one of them, and possibly Vermont and Massachusetts. So we decided to go to Massachusetts and get married in one of my favorite places in the States, which is P-Town, Provincetown, Massachusetts, right on Cape Cod, where there's a big, thriving gay community. So we actually drove, because he's from Chicago, and so we drove across country. So we stopped in Chicago, and so I met all of his friends, and I met all of his family, and then we stayed there for about a week, and then we drove from Chicago to New York, where he met all of my New York friends and my family in New York, and then we drove from New York to Massachusetts, where we got married on the beach in Provincetown very early in the morning on August 28th, 2009. And then we got in the car and we drove back across country, back to the United States, and started our life together as a married couple. And everything was going great. And he was 38. I think he had just turned 38. And I was a few years older than him. I think I was 42, maybe 45. I can't remember exactly. And I was at work one day. It was a Monday. I don't remember the exact date, but I could figure it out. I was at work, and he called me and said that he had been home that day. And he was I'll tell you that he was a chef. And so he loved, of course, he was a chef, he loved to cook. And I'm Italian from the Bronx, so I love to eat. And that was a big part of our lives. Like, and I was a lot heavier because every day, like I would wake up and there would be a gigantic breakfast, and he was Puerto Rican. And so at night there would always be like a big pernil, which is pork, pig. Um, we were constantly eating, and he was very healthy. He went to the gym every day. He was really built, like he was muscular. He had this fantastic body. He was gorgeous. But he called me up. I was at work. He called me up on this Monday morning, and he said that he had fainted, and he didn't feel well at all. And he was HIV positive, but he was also undetectable. So we weren't concerned about that at all. But he said he fainted and he felt really bad. When he got back up, he called me and he said that he didn't feel well at all. He wasn't sure what was going on. So I suggested that he go to the emergency room, which he did. And I got out of work and I met him at the hospital at Cedars here in Los Angeles. And like immediately when I got there, told him who I was looking for, I got to he had been admitted into the ICU, which was very strange, I thought. But as soon as I got there, the doctors grabbed me and said that he was doing really bad, that he had an extremely low number of platelets. He was anemic, and that he had cancer, that he had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it had spread throughout his body, and it was stage 4, and he had no indication that anything was wrong the entire time. He always, again, he felt great. He looked great. He was muscular. He went to the gym. He had energy. He ate. I mean, he had an appetite, like the whole thing. So it was it was really shocking. And so we had no idea what to do. We didn't know what to do. But he was in the ICU, and they started giving him transfusions. I think over the time that he was in the hospital, they gave him something like 21 transfusions, which is a crazy number. But none of it was working. His body was not taking it at all. It was just like his platelet numbers stayed the same, like very, very low. And I think it was. So this was a Monday when he went into the hospital. I think Wednesday, I was there in the hospital with him every day, all day, of course. And then it was Wednesday, I believe, where he was just really, really weak. And I was sitting there and I was holding his hand and we were talking. And he said, sorry. He said, "I don't want to die because I just found you." And then he closed his eyes and he went into a coma. So that was on Wednesday. He was in a coma for Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then on Sunday, December 28th. Oh, it was Christmas, of course. And so, of course, we had decorated our house. It was our first Christmas together. And in fact, because he was in the ICU, he couldn't really have visitors. And also, they wouldn't even allow me to bring Christmas gifts. I had, of course, a whole bunch of gifts that I was going to give him for Christmas. They would not allow me to bring the gifts into the ICU. But we talked about this too, and he said, "Don't worry, it'll be fine. Whenever, we'll just have Christmas as soon as I get back home." On Sunday, December 28th, he was in a coma, and the cardiologist came to me and he said that that Antonio was going to go into cardiac arrest, that he had maybe 15 minutes left. And he sat me down, and he explained to me what was about to happen. Antonio would go into cardiac arrest, and what they would have to do in order to try to save him was they would have to cut open his chest. They would have to break his ribs, move his ribs out of the way, and work on his heart, like with the cardiologist with his actual hands, like try to work on it. But he said, like looking at it, he said, I can tell you right now, it's not going to work. You know, we'll probably work on him for about 45 minutes, but I'm telling you, it's not going to work. There's no way that we're going to be able to save him. What do you want to do? What do I want to do? I don't know. And so I thought about it, I guess, for a second, although I was completely in shock. And I said, well, if it's not going to work, and why put him through all of that? Let's just stop. And by the way, the reason why they were asking me what I wanted to do was because I had a marriage certificate, which is why it's so important. I had a legal document saying that I was his partner, that I was his husband. Otherwise, they would not have let me into the ICU, just by the way. So I said, okay, I guess we should stop. So as soon as I said that, literally, they were like, okay, let's go. And so a room full of doctors and nurses ran out of the room, and they took all of the, took everything with them. They took the monitors, they unhooked things, gone. The only thing that was left was a ventilator, because he had been on a ventilator. Because his organs had started shutting down. His liver shut down, and his kidneys were about to shut down. They were talking about at one point during that day putting him on dialysis and all this stuff. But at any rate, as soon as I said, okay, let's stop, they were gone. The only thing left was the ventilator. So he was breathing. And I didn't know what to do. And there was this very kind nurse who saw that I was just like stunned and didn't know what to do. And she said, talk to him. She said, because somewhere in there he can hear you. Okay. So I got into bed. I crawled into bed with him, and I held him, and I started talking to him. And I told him how much I loved him. And I told him that, I said, don't worry about me, because I'll be okay. And I said, don't be afraid, because whatever is going to happen to you now is going to be great and fascinating and probably wonderful. And I just held him. And he was on the ventilator, like I said. So he kept breathing. But even though he was breathing, there was a very clear moment where I knew that he was gone, that he had died. I could feel it. It became very clear to me in an instant that he was gone, that the person I knew, that Antonio, was gone, and that what was here with me at that moment was just his body. It was just very clear to me, even though he was still breathing. And so I stayed there for a long time. Nobody came, nobody bothered me. They just let me stay there as long as I wanted, until I don't know how long I was there. But then I finally thought, okay, it's time for me to go. So I left. And then I went home. And this might possibly have been the worst part of it, in fact. I went home, and of course there was a Christmas tree with all of our Christmas gifts. So it took me many years, in fact, after that, for me to be able to enjoy Christmas again, because, And I remember I sat in my apartment for probably 2 weeks, and I don't remember eating. I know I lost a lot of weight. I think I must have been in shock. I was just completely stunned. I remember it must have maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, I remember this very distinctly, sort of getting up. It was very hard to sleep. I maybe slept 2, maybe 3 hours a day. And mostly I just sat and just kind of like, it was in my head. I remember there was this one day where I stood up and I looked out the window of our apartment, and I saw there were people outside. There were human beings like walking around, and there were cars driving by. And I remember very distinctly thinking, like, something is wrong. Something is really wrong. People, don't you understand? Like, what are you doing? The world has ended. How are you outside? Like, how are you walking? Like, how are you having lives? How are you talking to each other? I didn't understand, because in my mind, the world had ended. So I did that for a long time. And then finally, of course, I realized at one point, maybe a couple of months later, I realized that I really needed help. So somehow I found a grief therapy group. I found a group of people. There were 8 of us in this group, who all had lost spouses around the same time. So they put they put this group together. The place is called Our House here in Los Angeles, and they put this group together of 8 people, and we committed to a 1.5 years of grief therapy. So we went through this whole grief process for a 1.5 years together, which was tremendous, tremendously helpful. And I told them the story, of course, and of course they all wanted to hear the poem, which I still have in my wallet. A little piece of paper. The poem is called Wait for Him. Wait for the guy who calls you beautiful instead of hot, who calls you back when you hang up on him, who stays awake just to watch you sleep, who worries and takes care of you when you are ill. Wait for the guy who kisses your forehead, who wants to show you off to the world when you're wearing sweats, who holds your hand in front of his friends. Wait for the guy who is constantly reminding you of how much he cares about you and how lucky he is to have you. Wait for the guy who turns to his friends and says, "That's him." Wait for the guy who only wants you. And his name was Antonio Mojica. And when we got married, he took my name. So his name was Antonio Mojica Vaccaro. And it took me a long time, I think, to be able to live in the world again like a normal human being. I remember this very distinctly. It was about 2 years later, 2 full years, when I laughed for the very first time that I could remember since his death. I laughed out loud at something. I don't remember what I laughed at, but I laughed out loud, and it was this laugh that, that had been waiting 2 years to come out of me. And I was so filled with joy at the idea that I laughed, but that only lasted a second, because then I felt horrible for laughing. I thought, I can't possibly laugh. I can't possibly enjoy life ever again, because then that would be a betrayal. If I wasn't miserable for the rest of my life, that would be a betrayal to him. But it took me a while to realize that that, of course, was insane. And that I had to figure out a way to be a happy person, to be a happy, normal person. And so that, it's been quite a few years now. Of course, I still think about him every single day. I still miss him. I went through a very long period of time when where I would be home, for instance, and I lived in an apartment building. I would be home and I would hear some keys jangling out in the hallway. And immediately I would think, oh, Antonio's home. Or there would be times where something really wonderful would happen in my life. I'd get some great job or something really fun happened. And my first thought was to pick up my phone and call Antonio. I was like, oh, I can't. Right. Still happens to me all these years later. But I have figured out how to maneuver through life and be a happy person. And I realize that this grief will always be a part of me, will always be a part of who I am, always. And that's really fine. I'm really okay with that. So I met Antonio on April 28th, 2009, and he died we got married exactly 4 months later, August 28th, and he died on December 28th. We had exactly 8 months together. But it was 8 months of living with a rock star. And it will always be a part of me. That's my story.
Beautiful.